Hi, I'm Robert Patricia John Susan. This is a history project we are being forced to do, and today we're going to talk about the period after World War II, the 50s and 60s. After World War II was over, Russia and America stopped pretending to like each other, because nothing destroys a fake friendship faster than their common enemy's unexpected suicide. This was a time of paranoia and fear, and the swinging pendulum of social attitude, from cookie-cutter conformity to social reform and upheaval. Coming off the curtails of World War II, America was forced into the Cold War, which taught Americans the fear of Russia and communism. This turned man against man, or rather, Uncle Sam against the communist bear. Throughout the Cold War, people were only really ever scared of two things: space aliens and communists. The amount of B-rated sci-fi flicks was rivaled only by the number of people Senator Joseph McCarthy accused of being part of the Red Party, because nobody parties harder than the Red Party. Fear and paranoia of communism led many innocent people to lose their jobs and their families as a result of this Red Scare. Those unlucky souls convicted were blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, or the WHAC for short. Many immigrants arriving from Eastern Europe on the other side of the Iron Curtain were subject to scrutiny and hostility. In fact, many of the science fiction films may have been inspired by a fear of aliens from both outer space and from countries like Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. The hatred of communism brainwashed the American people into hating all people associated with it. It became the Americans' personal duty to eradicate it and maintain democracy. Propaganda about atomic war began circulating throughout the media. Characters like Bert the Turtle educated young students on the do's and don'ts of survival.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert.
Me from the past, please demonstrate the proper protocol for sudden atomic annihilation. Yes, that is correct. Good job. You are now slightly less dead from atomic destruction. Americans just generally tried to be better than them in everything they did, like in space, resulting in the space race, trying to be the very best like no one ever was. That's a song. Similarly, America and the Soviet Union tried to seem cooler than they were by building more weapons, bigger and newer, and threatening to use their new cool gadgets until eventually everyone was ridiculously overpowered, and it got super dangerous to be alive. If anyone did anything with those weapons, especially the nuclear ones, it would probably destroy the entire world. This is called mutually assured destruction. That's mad, dude! In fact, prior to the bombing of Hiroshima, some scientists were afraid that the use of a single atomic bomb would cause a chain reaction that would light the entire atmosphere on fire. They were so afraid that they hired this dude to check it out, and the dude was like, "Nah, you're cool, man." So the scientists whistled a merry tune and continued building their death bombs. Eventually, the US decided it would do something about communism that involved a lot more death. Eisenhower figured that it would be cool to give a little extra help to non-communist countries because of his rollback policy, contrasting with Truman's containment policy. South Vietnam was engaged in a brutal struggle with their communist neighbors to the north, during which Truman sent their goods to the south for how long?
So long.
A long time. Probably 20 years, or maybe 19. Eventually, the US decided to be a bit more physical when dealing with their haters. So they sent a whole bunch of soldiers down to South Vietnam to put the communist dudes in their place. Some guys weren't too happy about this turn of events, however. People all over America attacked the policy. The Kent State University protests, for example, led to burning buildings and National Guard showing up. The National Guard shot at the protesters, killing 4 students and wounding 9. This led to even more protests. The communism situation was creeping ever closer to the United States when Cuba established itself as a communist country. The CIA was like, and tried to invade Cuba, resulting in the Bay of Pigs crisis. Ultimately, the invasion failed because Cuba was just too fierce for the US to take down. Also, they had more guys. After the communist dictator Fidel Castro rose to power in Cuba, the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to improve their standing in the Cold War. They sent a message to Cuba along the lines of, "Hey Cuba, is it okay if we store weapons of mass destruction in your backyard?" And Cuba was all like, "Yeah, that's cool, I guess, just don't break anything. There's not much we can do about it anyway." So then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union and their killing machines were really close. Like, uncomfortably close. This was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there were missiles in Cuba, and it was a crisis. The Soviet Union then sent a message to America. So America totally blew off their first message and just decided to not invade Cuba. 50s, yo! Hashtag throwback to whack! And that cookie cutter conformity, y'all, because we're gonna talk about it a little. The 50s was a time where most people wanted to be like everyone else. And that's sorta how it happened. No one wanted to seem like communists, so they all became the same normal people. The white picket fence style of 1950s America was seen in everything from TV shows like I Love Lucy or Father Knows Best. These portrayals of nuclear families and patriarchal values characterized the attitude of society during this decade. Traditional gender roles of the time painted men to be workers in an office with a 9-to-5 job, while the women stayed home to cook, clean, and care for babies. It was a time of conformity where every family abided by the same societal standards. This was seen in where they lived as well. Suburban Levittowns, identical living developments, sprung up in New York and Pennsylvania, making all the houses look exactly the same because conformity, and probably laziness too. People couldn't just walk home anymore though, because everything was too far away all of a sudden. They needed cars. The National Interstate Defense Highways Act proposed and enforced by President Eisenhower, resumed the construction of several really big highways across the nation. This enabled easier transportation for civilians and armies alike, bringing a sense of security and closeness that united the nation. More and more cars were being purchased, becoming a normalcy. The status quo began to include owning a car, so more people bought them. This cycle inadvertently created a consumerist economy that still echoes today. Because the best economies are the ones that echo. Americans were so proud of their banging new economy and use of cutting-edge fancy technology that when Khrushchev came to visit Eisenhower in an effort to make some sort of peace, to be as petty as possible, Eisenhower arranged for him to take a helicopter ride over some very busy highways and parking lots to show off how swagalicious the new wheels were. Because that's exactly what I would do. Consumerism in America created the hive mindset of conforming and paying lots of money to fit in. Conformity, like the perfect nuclear family and the perfect nuclear bomb, as discussed earlier, was the standard. The people that disagreed with society and the Tupperware containers they were being forced into were being characterized as the rebellious Beat generation. They were basically like pre-hippies, like hippies, but before then. Earlier hippies. Hippies before it was cool to be a hippie. Hipster hippies. They inspired a love for colored rock and roll music that was scorned by their parents because it was too colorful, I guess. They were also much more lax about sex. Instead of being taboo and wrong, it became more mainstream and chill. They were the beginning of the social revolution, the demand for difference. This mentality was the basis for the time to come, the wild ride of social justice movements that were the 1960s. If you mention the 60s to most Americans, the image of marches and rallies come to mind. The 60s are most commonly characterized by these radical demonstrations, a stark contrast to the normal white America of the white picket fence image. The fight for basic human rights diverged from the traditional patriarchal society built on slavery that had dominated for hundreds of years. So it was naturally branded as radical and insane at the time, but today it is seen as the catalyst for social changes that are still in effect today. This idea that it was new and rebellious is not necessarily true. though, as reforms have been slowly occurring since the dawn of the 20th century. For example, the founding of the NACAPA, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, took place in 1909. World War II also saw the creation of CORE, or the Committee of Racial Equality, in 1942, which was strongly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolent movements. Many of the founders of CORE also participated in the pacifist anti-racist group, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Such a nice name. So overall, they were a peaceful group of dudes. CORE began protesting segregation with sit-ins, a popular form of non-violent protest, and an easy one, because you just sit somewhere, which is nice. Desegregation was the main goal of protesters during World War II, where the Double V campaign called for victory at home and abroad, wanting to separate Americans from Nazis by giving equality to people of all races. America had previously decided that separate but equal was acceptable in the court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. However, World War II brought new attention to the problem of segregation, and it was quickly taken to the Supreme Court again. Newly found radical liberalism made its way from the streets to the legal system with the beginning of the war in court. One of the first major decisions of the liberal court was Brown v. Board in 1954, which stated that segregated schools were unconstitutional. After this influential court case, schools slowly became more and more integrated. However, the war in court called for school day segregation with all deliberate speed. And many places deliberately took their time keeping segregation in place as long as possible, because if there's one thing the government does best, it's not doing anything. He's looking at you, government. This eventually led to events like the Little Rock Nine, where federal troops had to be called in by Eisenhower to escort 9 black students into the Arkansas all-white Central High School. This was one of the only instances of desegregation at first, however, as African Americans were often thrown under the bus during this time. Off the bus, too, come to think of it, because Rosa Parks. Busing was common when desegregating schools because things like white flight, where white people fled areas black people moved into, led to segregated living, and therefore segregated districts. Everything was segregated in America, including segregation, so the process of desegregation was filled with tribulations. Even buses had to be desegregated. Rosa Parks, a notable figure within the civil rights movement, refused to sit in the back of the bus on December 1st, 1955. 4 days later, the Montgomery bus boycotts began. African Americans refused to ride buses, so they refused to take part in segregation while simultaneously hurting the bus economy. Good for them! In 1956, the Montgomery Federal Court ruled that segregated bus seating violated the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizens equal protections under the law. Other social movement groups include the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. Yes, I am vomiting. Most early movements for civil rights were nonviolent, whereas over time they grew to be more focused on black nationalism rather than integration, as seen in the Black Panthers. Violent civil rights movements influenced people like Malcolm X, whereas nonviolent movements influenced leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. He led the March on Washington with his I Have a Dream speech, arguing that racism needs to end. Protests and demonstrations ultimately led to many laws being created in favor of equal rights, such as the 24th Amendment, which eliminated the poll tax, the Voting Rights Act, as well as the Loving v. Virginia court case, which legalized interracial marriage. None of these advancements could have been made without the government's support. The first time in a long time that these issues began to be recognized was with the election of President John F. Kennedy, who actually cared about social issues. However, his personal impact was short-lived because, spoiler alert, he was assassinated in 1963. He had a lot of influence on the government and introduced policies that helped people. Kennedy's Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, who may or may not have planned JFK's assassination by conspiracy theorists, became president and continued to carry through on civil rights with this idea of the Great Society. One of the most important advancements of the 60s was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that made discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, gender, etc. illegal. It gave rights not only to Afro-Americans, but women as well. The book Feminine Mystique was published in 1963 and is often credited with kickstarting the second wave of feminism in America. Once women were exposed to the ideas of equality and freedom, they wanted more. This led to the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which sought to end the gender wage gap, and the founding of the National Organization for Women, now, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which sadly never passed the state's approval, but passed Senate in 1972 after being introduced in 1923. History. It is a beautiful and epic evolution of human existence. From the mistakes of the past, we can learn to better the future. The battle for social rights reinstituted the democratic values of power to the people that America fought so hard to save during the Cold War. The 50s and 60s are juxtaposed against each other as a time of complete conformity versus utter rebellion. Life was drastically shifted in the 60s and has created the world as we know it today. Well, you know what they say.
Mr. Susan, what do they say?
Slam Class is produced and directed by Abigail Dean. Our script supervisor is Marshall Lentz. The graphics team is Idea Globule, and the show is written by my high school friends Kendra, Ebke, Mina, Bourquin, and Abby Dean. If you have questions about today's video, ask our high school history teacher, Joseph Schneider. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be dank. Were the 50s a time of conformity and oppression? Or a time of paranoia and fear? Does revolution start from the top down? Or the bottom up? Which are more effective, violent protests or non-violent protests?
Action.
Howdy, I'm Robert Pacheco.
Do you mind?
You're tearing this family apart!
So sorry. Mina?
I'm sorry.
There you go.
Do it again.
50s, yo! That one was good the first time.
Whoa!
Stop it!
The music man!
Sounds clarinets to the kids in the town.
Thank
With the big
you,
trombone.
Mom.
Yes, you go, Mom!
Eventually, the U.S. decided to be a bit more physical when dealing with the
Abby! Did it hit your head?
No.
I hope it does.
Action.
Similarly, America and the Soviet Union tried to seem cooler than they were by building more weapons, bigger and newer, and threatening to use their new cool gadgets until eventually everyone was ridiculous.
Shut up, Mina! Go to the beginning again.
No.
Okay.
The National Guard shot at them.
Abby!
They killed wounded nine.
Really? I hate Abby!
Go away.
Wait.